Chair, before I begin, I would like to say something to the colleagues from the PVV. We have several things in common, but the idea of a price cap just shows once again what an economic ignoramus is among the populace of the PVV. Because by setting artificially low prices, you make it unprofitable to produce new products. And so, more scarcity arises, and as a result, prices will rise even further. So that is typical of the socialist thinking that prevails within the PVV, which is unfortunate because they have good ideas about immigration, but the rest of their program is less impressive. So it's a pity, but that's how it is. Chair, here we have a historical overview of inflation over the past 200 years. What you see is that until around 1970, the value of the British pound remained almost completely constant. From 1800 to the mid-20th century, for about 150 years, you could buy roughly the same things for roughly the same amount of money. Of course, there were occasional fluctuations, a bad harvest, a war, but the overall trend was stable. And from the 1970s onward, this changes dramatically. A huge and structural increase in inflation, and thus a huge structural devaluation of savings. Structural annual inflation, Chair, is therefore a modern phenomenon. It simply did not exist in the past. The fact that modern economists defend it as good or positive for the economy is an expression of an ideological tunnel vision that serves the only actor who actually benefits from it, and that is the almighty, ever-expanding government. Here's how it works. In the 1970s, for the first time in world history, for the first time ever, the gold standard was abandoned. This means that, in principle, governments could start printing unlimited amounts of money. For the record, never before in the history of humanity have governments had this power. No king, dictator, emperor, or consul from the past ever possessed this extraordinary power, which democratic states appropriated for themselves in the 1970s. And because for the first time, again, for the first time in world history, there was suddenly no limit at all on government spending, since you could simply spend money without having to collect it through taxes just by turning on the printing press, politicians started doing exactly that. All the socialism we've seen since then, the growth of government with all the benefits, subsidies, and allowances, but also mass immigration, the disastrous climate, the pointless wars, the wind turbines, the European Union as such, all those wasteful, nonsensical projects that have been set up over the past decades have all been financed with money that governments could print out of thin air. However, governments still had to pay for these projects, and they did so through the back door via inflation. Year after year, they simply took it from the unsuspecting saver, whose money in their bank account became worth less. Moreover, this inflation is especially bad for the poor. This inflation, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's not some kind of Robin Hood-like scheme where money is taken from the rich. No, it's the opposite. Because it's precisely the poor who spend a larger portion of their income on consumption, whose prices are rising, who have fewer assets, fewer possessions that hold their value, and who have a little bit of savings somewhere in a bank account or stuffed in an old sock, which eventually just evaporates. So it's actually the poor who suffer from this. And that's also one of the explanations. That you see that since the 1970s, economies have become so heavily concentrated around ever smaller groups of wealthy people. That's a consequence of fiat money, a consequence of the ongoing inflation. I understand that a return to a sound gold standard overnight is unfeasible. But I would like to ask the government to consider, for example, the possibility of introducing a standard gold savings account as part of regular bank accounts, so that you don't put your money in an interest-bearing savings account, a fiat savings account, but simply in a physical gold savings account. And I also want to ask the government to stop systematically spending other people's money. Do not raise wages, do not impose price caps on products like the economically foolish PVV wants, but drastically cut government spending and lower taxes. That is the only way to restore our purchasing power in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you. I see an interruption from Mr. Valdegon.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I was actually a bit surprised that you called us fools here in the chamber. Look, we don't have to agree, but I find the choice of words, let me say, is not to my liking. I won't throw it back at you either, because then I would be going down the same abyss. We're not going to do that. Price caps can certainly have an effect. Look at France, where 5,000 products have been capped. Because maybe Forum doesn't think it's that important, but we stand for the Dutch citizen. Okay. Who will soon have to pay for their groceries. And then we're talking about basic foodstuffs, about bread, about cheese, about meat, about jam, you name it. Ordinary basic products that every family in this country needs. And they suffer the most if they can no longer afford them. And this is a very good way to tackle inflation and to help the citizens of the Netherlands a little. And I'm curious to hear Forum's position on this, whether they are also willing to do this for the citizens.
Mr. Baudet.
Yes, look, with socialism, it seems attractive in the short term. You think, well, you know what we'll do? We're going to cap the prices. So, for example, you mentioned meat. So then you tell a farmer you can't get more for a steak than a certain amount, or for a braising steak or ground beef or whatever. But that price is high because the farmer has all kinds of costs. For example, the cost of the stupid climate policy, which, by the way, we both oppose, the cost of the stupid nitrogen policy, the costs of increased housing expenses, electricity costs, which are partly a result of mass migration and also of the climate plans. So the farmer incurs certain costs, which he passes on to the supermarket, and the supermarket also has certain costs, for example, from the increased energy bills. Supermarkets, of course, have a lot of transportation costs, from distribution centers to the store, and also electricity costs for refrigeration and things like that. And the moment you start capping those prices, at some point, someone in that chain will stop making a profit. So that party will go under. So those products, those farm products, in this case, ground beef, pork shoulder, steak, and so on, they will no longer be produced because the farmer can no longer afford it. The result is that more scarcity arises. There is less supply of ground beef and so on. And so those prices will keep rising, at least for as long as they're still available. You end up with a black market where people start buying everything outside the supermarkets, outside the regular supply chains. So it doesn't work. A price ceiling doesn't work. It only works if you then, and that's of course the road to serfdom, as many economists have criticized socialism. If you then start telling farmers, oh, you'll get subsidies for that, and then you need subsidies for something else. So in the end, you end up in a kind of endless chain of subsidies, while the real problem, and that's what we need to address, is that people simply can't afford the energy plans, the energy transition, that farmers are going under completely because of the insane nitrogen regulations imposed by the government. If you would just say that, and by the way, we completely agree on that, but don't try to mask it with a price cap, because then people think, oh, it's not that bad, we can still buy some ground beef. And then all those farmers go under, and soon we'll have even less. It doesn't work. It's attractive in the short term, but in the long run, you destroy your economy. By the way, we've also seen this happen in the rental market. We've seen it in so many other sectors where the government intervened too much.
I think it's to be brief and concise in your answer. And I'm also going to challenge you to ask the question briefly and concisely. Mr. Fadigan.
I will certainly do that, Chair. It's very simple. Mr. Baudet cites wonderful economic theories, and there are probably economists who completely agree with him, but that man at the checkout doesn't benefit from your economic theories. What matters to him is that he can buy his groceries now and feed his family. And for that, a cap on certain products can indeed have an effect and be valuable. And we see in France, where 5,000 products are like this, limited in price, that it really does have an effect that people are able to eat. In your model, they have to wait 10 years before they can eat. That seems too long to me. They need to eat now. Short response.
I'm just thinking about that 10-year wait to eat. Then my poetic mind starts to imagine things, and that doesn't really work. But look, the French have understood a whole lot of things better than we have. The French understand love better than we do, the good life and so on. What they actually don't understand is economics. French society, French political theory, and they don't understand what a normal economy is. And that's also the reason why France is the sick old man of Europe. France doesn't have a normally well-functioning economy. And it compensates for that by constantly introducing new subsidies, new state interventions. And it only goes from bad to worse. It can't work. It can't work for a very simple reason. The price cap doesn't work because somewhere along the chain, someone goes bankrupt. You can't just say you have to produce below market value. High prices, let me put it this way, high prices lead to low prices, and low prices lead to high prices. And it's very simple. The moment something is too expensive, when something is offered at too high a price, suppose it were true that the farmer is making an outrageous profit on his ground beef, because that's the implication behind capping prices. A farmer is not allowed to ask more than a certain amount for milk, a certain amount for ground beef. Apparently, he's making excessive profits. Okay, but if that were the case, then a lot of people would think, hey, that's nice, I'm going to become a farmer. And then that excessively high price would naturally lead to an increase in supply, and therefore naturally to a decrease in prices. That's the market mechanism. That's how a free society works. The moment you turn it around, when you say you're no longer allowed to make a profit on your milk, you're no longer allowed to make a profit on your ground beef, then all those farmers will think, guys, forget it. I'm going to live in Ibiza. I'm going to do something else with my life. I'm going into politics. I'm very sorry. We both love classical music. We're both against classic immigration. But when it comes to economics, the PVV is actually more left-wing than the SP. I'm very sorry. You're wrong. Change course.
Mr. Valdegan, you have a follow-up question.
Yes, I actually have just one question. What do you say to those people who can't pay their bills at the checkout because they still have months left while their money has already run out? Your economic theories are of no use to them. And maybe there's a nice job waiting for you in France if I listen to you like this.
Mr. Baudet.
What we say to those people is very simple. If you stop the climate plans, scrap the nitrogen plans, and put an end to mass immigration, then prices will drop immediately. Then you can drastically lower taxes. The VAT can be reduced. The excise duties can be lowered. Energy costs will become cheaper. It will become cheaper to feed your cows. These are all real measures that actually help people, which will cause prices to fall and purchasing power to rise immediately. That is realistic policy. That is the kind of policy we also support. You really don't need such a gigantic government as we have now. Only if the government keeps making itself even bigger by introducing price caps, then you're actually implementing counterproductive policies.
Thank you. I see that Mr. Gimmies also has a question. Mr. Gimmies?
Yes, Chair. That graph led me to two questions. Because according to Mr. Baudet, August 15th, 1971 marks the great fall from grace, namely the abandonment of the gold standard. Yes, a decision by President Nixon. Edin Mujagic has written a fantastic book about it, Turning Point 1971, highly recommended, by the way. But a double question. First, what was the rationale behind the United States abandoning the gold standard? There was a rationale behind it, and Mr. Baudet knows that too. If they hadn't done that, they would have run out of their gold reserves in no time, among other reasons, alongside many other disadvantages. But that was a very important geopolitical disadvantage. And secondly, why is it that while Mr. Baudet criticizes price caps and says the market should resolve things itself, he's now making this plea to these ministers? We hear him advocating for a savings account specifically for gold at the bank. Mr. Baudet could just buy a gold bar himself, couldn't he? He doesn't need these ministers for that, does he?
Mr. Baudet.
Yes, so indeed, Mujagic is one of the many economists, people in the Netherlands, but of course internationally there are many more people who say more or less the same things as I do. So I don't claim any originality, and apart from the PVV, I think most people understand what I'm talking about. But yes, and why did that happen? For the very simple reason that governments, with the United States leading the way, but not the only ones, it happened throughout the Western world because they couldn't control themselves. And why couldn't they control themselves? Because in a democracy, you win elections with all sorts of campaign promises. Gifts for this group, gifts for that group. And if there is also a military-industrial complex that wants to wage wars everywhere, that puts pressure on you where you have to invest more in weapons and things like that. Yes, then at a certain point it becomes unaffordable based on the available gold reserves. And then you have two options. You can either slow yourself down and tighten your belt. That would have been the better option. Or you can play the ultimate game of bluff poker and say, well, our money is no longer based on anything other than trust. And we're going to pay a bunch of economists to write textbooks about it and pretend that's completely normal. And it's completely normal to have 2% inflation, 3% inflation per year. That's what they've done, but I think more and more people are realizing that this system isn't sustainable in the long run. And that this just creates a very unfair kind of economy. And that's, of course, the whole point of Piketty and so on, where our friends on the left and at the PVV think, yeah, you need more government to level things out. No, wait a minute. The whole playing field is skewed to begin with. And that leads to the poorest in particular ending up with losses because they have to spend a larger portion of their income on consumption. They can't invest. And that also brings us right away to the question about gold. Look, of course, people who can afford it have physical gold stored in their safes or in vaults in Switzerland. They own all kinds of houses that hold their value. They have art that retains its value and so on. But especially the step towards... Look, and why does gold have intrinsic value? Because women want gold and men want women. That is the reason there will always be... Gold will always have value, always retain its value. So for people, for ordinary people with a few hundred or a few thousand euros in savings, the step to convert their money in that way, to turn fiat into gold, is a big one. And if you facilitate that with, say, at your ABN or ING, a savings account, not just your regular orange savings account where you get 1.5% interest or so, but also an actual gold account, that can be facilitated. That is actually a very creative idea from our party, if I may say so myself. You can simply organize that, you can facilitate it, and then you essentially hedge the economy against the ongoing inflation. It's simple, it's budget neutral. There is really no reason not to do it. And that way we can also, because that's my second motion that I will submit shortly, we also have a good argument to bring our gold reserves back from Fort Knox and to return them here to our own country. Thank you.